The U.S. intervention in Guatemala and the Guatemalan Civil War. The United Fruit Company and its presence in Central America. In 1899, the Fruit Company was created by Minor Cooper Keith, Andrew Preston, and Lorenzo Dow Baker. The United Fruit Company was an extremely successful owned American corporation that profited greatly from investments made in Guatemala. The company primarily traded bananas grown on Latin American plantations. The bananas were sold in the United States and Europe. The United Fruit Company was capitalized at $11.23 million. Bradley Palmer was the United Fruit Company's director on the executive team. Palmer's company proceeded to buy or buy a share in 14 competitors, assuring them 80% of the banana import business in the United States as their main source of income. The company catapulted the United States into financial success. The United Fruit Company was also known to have intervened in the development of Latin America. The United Fruit Company had operated under the pretense of helping develop areas in Central and South America. These nations included Costa Rica and Guatemala, which became known as the Banana Republics. The Banana Republics was meant to be a disdainful term for poor, developing countries that relied on a single cash crop, such as bananas, and were ruled by corrupt governments. The United Fruit Company gained control of 42% of Guatemala's land and was exempted from paying taxes and import duties. 77% of all Guatemalan exports went to the United States, and 65% of imports to the country came from the United States. The United Fruit Company was essentially a state within Guatemala. It not only allowed all of the Guatemala's banana production and monopolized banana exports, but it also owned the country's telephone and telegraph system, and almost all of its railroad tracks. The United Fruit Company was responsible for building a great amount of infrastructure that was said to improve the quality of life and generate job opportunities. However, they instead cleared rainforests in Costa Rica, Colombia, Guatemala, Honduras, and Panama to build plantations, railroads, towns to house workers, and the country's only port at Puerto Barrios on the Atlantic coast. Many people migrated to banana zones in hopes that they could find relatively high-paying jobs. These densely packed farms had little biological diversity, making them ripe for disease epidemics. The infrastructure connecting these farms could quickly spread disease, in which it did. The Panama disease came into effect in the 1910s. This happened when a fungus began to take effect on the gross Michael banana plantations, which at the time dominated the global export trade. The Panama disease first came into effect in Panama and later throughout Central America, spreading quickly. In a race against the Panama disease, banana companies abandoned infected plantations in Costa Rica, Honduras, and Guatemala, which left thousands of farmers and workers jobless. The election of Jacobo Arbenz and his attempt to nationalize land, some belonging to the United Fruit Company. In November 1950, presidential elections were held in Guatemala. The result was a victory for the Democratic Socialist Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, who received 65.44% of the vote. The vote turnout was 71.6%. Arbenz vowed to take Aravelo's peaceful revolution a step farther by redistributing all idle land to the peasants. President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman and the Guatemalan Congress implemented sweeping reforms by passing new laws that gave workers the right to form unions. This included the 40,000 Guatemalans who worked for the United Fruit Company. Jacobo Arbenz passed the Agrarian Reform Law, a Guatemalan land reform law, on June 17, 1952, during the Guatemalan Revolution. The Agrarian Reform Law, also known as Decree 900, included Arbenz taking a large chunk of land from the United Fruit Company in exchange for a $1.2 million compensation. It redistributed unused land, greater than 224 acres, in area to local peasants, compensating landowners with government bonds. Land from at most 1,700 states was redistributed to about 500,000 individuals, 1/6 of the country's population. The goal of the legislation was to move Guatemala's economy from pseudo-feudalism into capitalism. Although in force for only 18 months, the law had a major effect on the Guatemalan land reform movement. However, with this, Arbenz became a secret opponent of Guatemalan dictator George Ubico. In the 1930s, Zimmerman aligned the United Fruit Company closely with the government of President George Ubico. The company received import duty and real estate tax exemptions from Ubico. He also gave them hundreds of square miles of land. The United Fruit Company controlled more land than any other individual or group. This made it very hard for Arbenz to execute his plan of distributing land to peasants. On the right-hand corner, Dwight Eisenhower is on the left, George Ubico is in the middle, and Jacobo Arbenz is on the right. The U.S. backed coup and the resulting Civil War. The United States and the United Fruit Company demanded $16 million instead of the $1.2 million compensation. Jacobo Arbenz refused this, and this led to Eisenhower authorizing the CIA to organize Operation Success to overthrow Jacobo Arbenz. The United States was initially involved in equipping and training Guatemalan security forces that murdered thousands of civilians in the nation's civil war. The agency selected Guatemalan Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas to lead the U.S.-backed coup and finance and train Castillo's rebels to back up the invasion with CIA-piloted planes. During and after the coup, more than 9,000 Guatemalan supporters of Arbenz was arrested as Washington gave the military foreign aid. He quickly outlawed more than 500 trade unions and returned more than 1.5 million acres to the United Fruit Company and the country's other big landowners. The Guatemalan Civil War fought from 1960 to 1996. The war was between the government of Guatemala and various leftist rebel groups, which were primarily supported by ethnic Maya, indigenous people, and Ladino peasants. During Guatemala's 36-year civil war, an estimate of 200,000 Guatemalans were killed in the United States. An independent commission was formed to investigate human rights abuses as well. The 1999 UN Truth Commission found that 83% of casualties were indigenous Maya, and 93% of human rights violations were perpetrated by state, military, or paramilitary forces. As the Cold War raged in the 1960s and 70s, the United States gave the Guatemalan military $33 million in aid, even though the U.S. officials were aware of the Army's dismissed track record on human rights. The U.S. contributed to human rights violations both directly through providing military aid, provision of weapons, and teaching techniques to the Guatemalan military, in helping them plan operations such as overthrowing democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, and paving the way for military rule. On June 27, 1954, democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz was deposed in a CIA-sponsored coup to protect the profits of the United Fruit Company. Arbenz was replaced by decades of brutal U.S.-backed regimes who committed widespread torture and genocide.
The rule of Rios Montt and his alliance with the United States. Rios Montt was a Guatemalan army general and politician. He ruled Guatemala as a military leader and dictator from 1982 to 1983. He assumed dictatorial powers after a coup overthrew the corrupt Guatemalan government. He dealt with corruption and political instability so effectively that Ronald Reagan lifted the United States arms embargo that was initially put into place by President Carter. Rios Montt's rule also received moral and financial support from American evangelical Christians. Guatemala received more support from the United States as well, even as human rights violations continued. Between 1982 and 1983, the United States sent Guatemala's military $4 million of spare helicopter parts and $6.3 million worth of other military supplies. The United States continued to sell helicopter parts to their military even after CIA reports of increased right-wing violence and dead bodies. This being said, U.S. aid was revoked from Guatemala. The picture in the upper right-hand corner is Ronald Reagan, and in the background behind him are Guatemalan soldiers, and it represents his alliance with Rios Montt and all of the money and military supplies the United States gave to Guatemala during this time. The genocide enacted by Rios Montt. Even though Rios Montt only ruled for 17 months, in the first 3 months, around 10,000 people were killed, and during the first 8 months, there were 19 massacres each month, and more than 400 indigenous communities destroyed. This is because the Guatemalan army identified Mayans as an internal enemy as a base of guerrilla support. The guerrilla, also known as Guerrilla Army of the Poor, was a leftist movement to support indigenous Mayan people during the Guatemalan Civil War. Rios Montt's objective appeared to be to kill the greatest number of people. He achieved this by ordering the state to commit various sickening crimes like extrajudicial executions, forced disappearances, sexual violence, death squads, the denial of justice, and other crimes and violations, all with the victims largely from indigenous and rural communities. This picture in the upper right-hand corner is Rios Montt. Rigoberta Menchú and the social movement to end the war and human rights atrocities. Rigoberta Menchú was an influential and strong figure from the Guatemalan Civil War era. This video gives a little introduction to Menchú and her achievements.
Porque si no me hubieran dado la oportunidad de hablar, imposible que hubiera podido lograr por mi cuenta. Lo que yo doy es solamente una contribución, un grano de arena. Para mí no hay héroes, no hay uno más héroe que otro. Simplemente cuando uno le toca en la piel hacer algo, no tiene opción.
Rigoberta Menchú co-founded RUOG, which is the United Representation of the Guatemalan Opposition, and she was a leading advocate of Indian rights and ethno-cultural reconciliation. Menchú was motivated by the brutal murders of her brother, mother, and father. She had been advocating for the rights of indigenous farmers ever since childhood with her father, and continued with more inspiration as she grew older, especially since the Guatemalan army murdered her entire family. Menchú founded WINAC, which was Guatemala's first indigenous political party as well, and ran for president in Guatemala twice. She is currently a UNESCO Goodwill Ambassador and Nobel Peace Prize winner. The most influential social movement to end the war and human rights atrocities was the Pan-Mayan movement. This movement helped to revitalize Mayan language, religion and spirituality, knowledge, Mayan schools, and political consciousness. During their brutal repression during the Civil War and Rios Montt's genocide, major changes in Mayan political views occurred. The Pan-Mayan movement aided in keeping Mayan culture alive and revitalized. The Pan-Mayan movement's goals were to recognize and value every Mayan identity and language, which helped the Guatemalan indigenous communities become more united. The Pan-Mayan movement and other Mayan social movements gained more power and influence towards the end of the Guatemalan Civil War. Indigenous rights were more strongly advocated for by international and non-governmental organizations, which assisted in starting to reduce all the human rights violations in Guatemala. Currently, Rigoberta Menchú and the Pan-Mayan movement work tirelessly to help reduce Mayan discrimination and violence towards the Mayans. Indigenous Guatemalans having more interest in politics also helps so that they have more of a voice for the future. The picture in the lower right-hand corner is Rigoberta Menchú.